Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are focusing squarely on how institutional conflicts shape current adoption policy and federal advocacy. We're unpacking a really fascinating forensic report that analyzes the structural ecosystem of the National Council for Adoption. You'll hear me call them the NCFA. We're going to dive deep into a structural analysis of an organization that sits literally right at the center of the American adoption industry.
To follow this investigative thread, we'll break it down into 6 parts: the adoption ecosystem explained, the regulatory revolving door, boardroom conflicts of interest, funding the supply chain, consolidating the adoption market, and finally, the structural bottom line.
Part 1. The Adoption Ecosystem Explained, or Decoding the NCFA's Mission. We're kicking off our structural map by looking at how the NCFA positions itself versus what this forensic report claims it actually does.
Now, there is a pretty stark contrast between the public brand and the private reality here. Publicly, the NCFA presents itself as this preeminent, ethical, nonpartisan voice for child welfare in the U.S. But the forensic report? It argues a completely different thesis. It suggests the NCFA actually operates less like an independent child welfare advocate and way more like a trade association, one that's structurally designed to consolidate market power and protect the interests of private adoption agencies.
To understand why the report makes that claim, we really have to look back at their origins. The report points out that the NCFA was historically engineered back in 1980 specifically to protect the adoption industry from external scrutiny. At that time, adult adoptees were actually organizing a civil rights movement to get access to their original birth certificates. The analysis details how private adoption agencies essentially mobilized to form the NCFA, actively pushing back against open records. Why? Well, to shield agencies from liability and protect the foundational secrecy of the baby scoop era.
That history brings us to Part 2, the regulatory revolving door and executive leadership transitions. Let's see how this historical mission translates into their modern operations by looking closely at their leadership pipeline.
If we look at their executive turnover, we see a highly compressed era of leadership changes. After a really long period of stability that ended in 2021, rapid shifts follow, culminating in 2026 with the hiring of Kate Kennedy. Kennedy brings decades of high-level nonprofit fundraising experience, and the report notes her arrival signals a strategic pivot for the organization toward aggressive philanthropic capitalization to handle a changing landscape. But honestly, the really fascinating transition here is the one right before her, the departure of Ryan Hanlon in 2025.
To grasp what happened right before Kennedy arrived, we first need to define a really crucial concept: regulatory capture. This is when a regulatory agency gets co-opted to advance the commercial interests of the very sector it's supposed to be regulating. The report uses this exact term to describe Ryan Hanlon's departure, arguing that the lines between private industry advocacy and public federal oversight have become totally blurred. So here's the crucial point. Hanlon went from being the chief lobbyist for the private adoption industry straight into a regulatory appointment as the Associate Commissioner of the U.S. Children's Bureau. That is the federal agency overseeing child welfare. Once there, he pushed an initiative called A Home for Every Child. According to the source material, critics say this metric-driven approach prioritizes rapidly expanding substitute care in foster homes. They argue this structurally expands the child welfare surveillance state, rather than investing those resources in keeping children safely with their biological families.
Moving on to Part 3, boardroom conflicts of interest and who exactly governs the NCFA. We have to look at the boardroom because the forensic analysis highlights what it calls an inescapable structural conflict of interest at the governance level. Take a close look at who actually holds the reins of this organization. The board is completely dominated by the chief executives of major, legacy private adoption agencies, places like Spence Chapin and the Gladney Center, alongside massive corporate consulting interests like KPMG. These are individuals whose own agencies rely economically on the continuous acquisition and placement of adoptable infants.
According to the analysis, this creates a profound conflict of interest. The report states it pretty plainly, saying their fiduciary duty to their respective agencies is fundamentally at odds with any policy that might reduce the supply of adoptable children. Think about it. If the NCFA truly prioritized things like family preservation, universal health care, and poverty relief, infant relinquishments would naturally drop. But a drop in relinquishments would directly threaten the revenue models of the adoption agencies run by its own board of directors.
This is where the structural map gets incredibly compelling. Part 4, funding the supply chain and the money trail. To see how this governance translates into real-world action, We're going to follow the money and look at the NCFA's financial capitalization. $2.38 million. That was the NCFA's total revenue in fiscal year 2025. That's a massive leap. I mean, it's more than doubled their revenue from the previous year. The source analysis shows this growth was driven heavily by strategic in-kind contributions and massive federal grants designed to maintain the organization's lobbying and public relations power.
Okay, let's zoom in on one specific federal grant from the Department of Health and Human Services. Remember, that's the exact same federal agency Ryan Hanlon moved to. This grant funds the Adoption-Sensitive Clinical Care Project. The report argues this taxpayer money is being used to train 10,000 hospital workers, effectively deputizing labor and delivery nurses to act as preliminary intake vectors for the private adoption industry. Critics say this creates highly asymmetric power dynamics, subtly steering vulnerable, under-resourced patients toward relinquishment right while they are in the delivery ward.
Furthermore, the analysis points out that the NCFA's public research is heavily subsidized by private think tanks like the OPTS Institute. The OPTS Institute explicitly aims to use corporate marketing strategies to promote adoption over other pregnancy options, especially following the end of federal abortion protections. Critics of the industry argue this completely compromises the objective validity of NCFA research. They claim the surveys use leading questions and systematically exclude the dissenting voices of adult adoptees.
Which brings us to Part 5, consolidating the adoption market through legislative advocacy. This is how the NCFA flexes its financial and structural muscle directly on Capitol Hill to shape federal policy. The report maps out their primary legislative targets, starting with the adoption tax credit. The NCFA aggressively lobbies to make this credit fully refundable. The forensic analysis explains that this acts as a massive demand-side subsidy. It uses government funds to incentivize child redistribution, essentially underwriting the exorbitant fees charged by private agencies, all while, as critics are quick to note, direct financial assistance to keep impoverished biological families together remains chronically underfunded.
At the same time, the NCFA heavily champions the ADOPT Act. Publicly, this is presented as a consumer protection bill to stop deceptive advertising by independent, unlicensed adoption facilitators. However, the report argues this is actually a calculated, tactical move to crush market competition. By using federal regulations to eliminate independent brokers, the NCFA forces all adoption traffic and the massive fees that come with it back to the highly regulated, dues-paying agencies that literally sit on their own board of directors.
Finally, Part 6, the structural bottom line and a summary of the systemic critique. Let's pull all these threads together to understand the ultimate structural takeaway of this entire institutional ecosystem, according to our source material. The report makes a very careful, clear distinction. There is no evidence of discrete legal criminality, embezzlement, or statutory fraud by NCFA leadership. But as they point out, the absence of criminality doesn't mean the absence of systemic bias. The conclusion is that the organization is trapped by its own structural determinants. It operates effectively as an industry protectionist syndicate that relies on poverty and inequality to generate its child supply, all while using massive, well-funded PR campaigns to marginalize the organic critiques of adult adoptees and birth mothers. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider a final question. Based on the structural conflicts, the revolving doors, and the financial supply chains we've mapped out today, does the current adoption ecosystem prioritize the holistic well-being of families or the market demands of the industry? It's a provocative question, for sure, but one that strikes at the very heart of how we approach child welfare in the modern era. Thanks so much for joining me for this structural deep dive.